On August 6, 1890, New York State was ready to show off a modern marvel, the electric chair. It was supposed to be the future of execution, quick, scientific, and above all, humane. But for its first unwilling volunteer, William Kemmler, it was a complete nightmare. The first 17-second shock didn't kill him. What happened next was a chaotic spectacle of smoke, the sickening smell of burning flesh, and a fumbled, desperate effort to finish the job. It left witnesses horrified and the press declaring they would have done better using an axe. This is the story of how a promise of scientific progress spiraled into one of history's most gruesome public disasters. Section 1. A humane alternative and the war of currents. So, how did we get the electric chair in the first place? It didn't start with a desire for a more lethal machine, but a search for a more civilized one. By the late 19th century, the public was growing squeamish about hanging. It was often a long, grisly spectacle that depended entirely on the condemned person's weight and the hangman's skill. A small miscalculation could lead to slow, agonizing strangulation or even decapitation. In an age of scientific wonder, people wanted a method that felt clean, modern, and fitting for a forward-thinking nation. The idea for electrocution actually came from a dentist, of all people, named Alfred Southwick. In 1881, he saw a drunk man accidentally touch the live terminals of a generator and die instantly, seemingly without any pain. To Southwick, this looked far more humane than a rope. He started pushing for electrical execution, and New York, which was looking to reform its death penalty laws, took an interest. In 1888, the state passed the Electrical Execution Act, making it the first government in the world to adopt the method. But this search for a humane death quickly got tangled up in one of the biggest corporate rivalries of the era, the war of currents. In one corner, you had Thomas Edison, the famous inventor and champion of direct current DC. In the other was George Westinghouse, the industrialist backing the more efficient, but supposedly more dangerous, alternating current AC developed by Nikola Tesla. Edison saw his DC empire being threatened by a C's superior range, so he launched a nasty smear campaign to paint AC as lethally dangerous. He staged public demonstrations where he used Westinghouse's AC generators to electrocute stray dogs, calves, and even a horse, all to burn the association of AC with death into the public's mind. So, when New York had to choose a current for its new electric chair, Edison saw his chance. Though he claimed to be against capital punishment, he worked behind the scenes to make sure the chair would be powered by a C. He wanted every headline about the first execution to be a subtle jab at his competitor. The electric chair was no longer just about justice. It was a weapon in a corporate war, and its first test subject was about to be caught right in the middle. Section 2. The man on the chair, the man fated to be that test subject, was William Kemmler. Born in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, to German immigrant parents, Kemmler's life was one of hardship and alcoholism. He dropped out of school when he was just 10 and was functionally illiterate. He eventually made a living as a vegetable peddler. By all accounts, he was a heavy drinker, and it was during a drunken rage in March of 1889 that he committed the crime that sealed his fate. In a fit of jealousy, Kemmler accused his common-law wife, Matilda Tilly Siegler, of planning to run off with a friend. The argument exploded, and he grabbed a hatchet, striking her again and again. Afterward, he walked to a neighbor's house and calmly told them what he had done. His trial was fast. Kemmler was convicted of first-degree murder and, just 3 days later, sentenced to die under New York's new law. He would be the first person in history to be executed by electrocution. This new sentence immediately set off a legal firestorm. Kemmler's lawyers, secretly funded by a desperate George Westinghouse who didn't want his AC technology branded as the executioner's current, appealed the sentence. They argued that electrocution was untested and possibly torturous, making it cruel and unusual punishment under the Eighth Amendment. The case, known as In re Kemmler, went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. In a landmark ruling, the court decided against him. Their reasoning: because the method was intended to be more humane, it didn't violate the Constitution. The legal path was now clear. All that remained was the execution itself. Section 3. The morning of August 6, 1890. On the morning of August 6, 1890, a strange and eerie calm hung over Auburn prison. William Kemmler was woken at 5 a.m. He got dressed in a suit, tie, and a clean white shirt. After a final breakfast and a prayer, the top of his head was shaved for the electrode. At 6:38 a.m., he was led into the execution chamber. The room was filled with 17 official witnesses, including doctors and reporters, all there to see the triumph of a clean, modern death. Kemmler's composure was stunning. He didn't fight or cry. As Warden Charles Durston presented him, Kemmler looked at the strange wooden chair with its straps and wires and said, "Gentlemen, I wish you all good luck. I believe I am going to a good place, and I am ready to go." He sat down, but the warden asked him to get up again so they could cut a hole in his suit to attach the second electrode to his spine. Kemmler did so without a word of protest. Once he was strapped in, his face covered, and the damp sponge electrode pressed to his shaved head, he gave one last piece of advice: "Take it easy and do it properly. I'm in no hurry." The warden simply replied, "Goodbye, William," and gave the order. The story of what happened next is a grim reminder of the massive gap that can exist between theory and reality. It's a dark piece of history that makes you question what we really mean by progress. If you're finding this story as fascinating as it is unnerving, please take a second to subscribe to the channel. We dig into forgotten but important moments from the past like this every week, and your support is what makes it all possible. Now, let's get back to that execution chamber. Section 4. Far worse than hanging. The switch was thrown, and about 1,000 volts of alternating currents surged through William Kemmler's body. For 17 seconds, the power was on. Kemmler's body tensed, his face turned red, and he strained against the leather straps. Now, when the current was shut off, Dr. Edward Spitzka, one of the physicians present, declared Kemmler dead. For a moment, it seemed the great experiment was a success. But it wasn't. As the doctors got closer, witnesses watched in horror as a low groan came from Kemmler's lips and his chest began to move. He was still breathing. Panic swept the room. Dr. Spitzka, losing his composure, yelled, "Have the current turned on again? Quick, no delay." What followed was pure chaos. The generator had been powered down and needed time to recharge before it could deliver another shock. For what felt like an eternity, some said over a minute, the witnesses. Doctors and the warden could only watch as the man in the chair gasped for air. While some experts later argued he was likely unconscious, for the people in that room, it was a waking nightmare. Finally, the generator was ready. This time, they would make sure. The voltage was cranked up to 2,000 volts. The second shock was a prolonged horror. The intense power began to cook Kemmler from the inside out. Smoke started to rise from the electrode on his head, and a blue flame flickered near the base of his spine. The room filled with a sickening smell of burning hair and charred flesh. Blood vessels under his skin burst. Several witnesses fainted, while others ran from the room, overcome with nausea. The district attorney who had prosecuted the case even collapsed in the hallway. The whole ordeal took about 8 minutes. When the power was finally cut for the second time, there was no doubt. William Kemmler was dead, but the scene was one of utter butchery. A reporter for the New York Times would later write it was an awful spectacle. Far worse than hanging. George Westinghouse, whose technology was now tied to the grisly event, gave the final, damning review. They would have done better using an axe. Section 5. Public outrage and a gruesome legacy. The execution, which was supposed to usher in a new age of humane justice, had become a public relations catastrophe. Newspapers all over the country ran sensational headlines describing the historic bungle in graphic detail. The Chicago Tribune wrote that Kemmler was actually tortured to death with a refinement of cruelty that was unequaled in the Dark Ages. The witnesses were shamed in the press for what they had been a part of. The doctors at the autopsy tried to save face, claiming the first shock had probably knocked Kemmler out, and that the botch was due to human error like misplaced electrodes, not a problem with the method itself. But the damage was done. The public was horrified. The first use of the electric chair hadn't proven it was more humane than hanging. It had just shown that science could invent a new, uniquely technological kind of horror. Despite this disastrous debut, the electric chair didn't go away. In fact, it spread. By 1915, over a dozen states had adopted it as their main method of execution. The legal precedent from the Supreme Court case had cleared the way, and the idea of electrical efficiency still appealed to lawmakers. Over the next century, more than 4,200 people would die in the electric chair in the United States. The legacy of William Kemmler's execution is a complicated one. It was a grim milestone in the history of capital punishment, an event that ignited a fierce debate over the ethics of state-sanctioned killing and what cruel and unusual punishment really means. It serves as a chilling example of what can happen when scientific ambition outpaces technical skill, and when a human life becomes a pawn in a corporate feud. The story of William Kemmler is a dark intersection of justice, science, and raw ambition. His death in that Auburn prison chamber was a spectacle of failure, a horrific twisting of the very idea of progress. The event was supposed to mark a new era of clean and swift punishment. Instead, it left a permanent, ugly stain on the history of technology and law. Kemmler's death was a grim milestone, but did it really represent progress, or just a new kind of horror? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this story compelling, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you don't miss our next exploration into the dark corners of history. Thanks for watching.